Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along. I'm going to be chairing this this session. I'm Clive Barnett. I'm working with Nick on the project, which is sort of whatever sponsoring, organising the series with Jessica and Kirsty. So I'm sort of in charge, whatever that means in this context. Last time, for those of you who came along, and I suspect it was most of you, last time we really heard people talk about the history and the historical context of mass observation. The next couple of sessions this time, and then the next seminar, which is in September, we're going to hear from projects explicitly using mass observation materials to tell stories about COVID-19, about the pandemic over the last year or so. And then the last couple of seminars in the series, which will be in October and November, will kind of broaden out and hear from other sort of life writing and diary-based and qualitative research projects as well. So what we've got today is kind of 3 talks, about 15-20 minutes each, from 3 projects. First of all, from Mathew Thomson from Warwick, and then from Lyon and Rebecca Coleman from Kenton Goldsmiths, and then Nick and I'll talk to some of the thoughts that Nick and I have had come out of our project. So and I think as we did last time, the idea is that we'll kind of go through the 3 talks, and then we'll take kind of questions at the end of that process. If you have kind of questions as we go along, then feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll kind of sweep them up and curate them at the end of the discussion. So that's the plan. I hope that makes sense and everybody's happy with that. Just to remind everybody, actually being recorded, so hope you might. I'm sort of tend to think there must be more to say, but there's no point sort of talking about what happens if there's a fire alarm or anything like that in this context, is there? So what we'll do then is let's move on to the first speaker. It's Mathew Thomson from Warwick, and Matthew's going to talk on reflections on the histories of COVID, mental health, and the NHS via mass observation. So over to you, Mathew.
Thank you, Clive. Let me just share my screen to start with, hopefully. You get that? Yep. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I wish I was as far along the line as Clive has promised there. This is a little bit more in the terrain of what I would do if I got my act together. But I have managed to throw in some bits and bobs of material from the COVID collection in the paper today, which has been very kindly, I've been given access to that by Kirsty and Jessica. So I hope it will give a little bit of a flavour of some of the material in the collection. All right, let me just go on. So I don't know if you can see all of that, but anyway, just to talk you through where I'm coming from. So I think there are kind of 5 starting points for this, yeah. And in a sense, what I'm trying to think my way through is how various projects that I am engaged in and I have been engaged in can connect around the COVID material. So the first of these is for the last 5 years or so, I have been involved in a Wellcome funded project on the cultural history of the NHS with colleagues here at Warwick. And this project is aiming to move beyond an institutional and sort of medical and political history of the NHS to address the issue of what we feel about the NHS, what the NHS means to us, and how that has come about and how that has changed across time. And I think that it doesn't take rocket science to understand that actually the COVID moment is an important episode within that history. So I'm conscious that I'm supposed to be writing a book on this, and I need to get my head around where COVID fits within this. And I think the mass observation material will be really valuable. I've also been using some wonderful material that Mass Observation Project has collected since the start of the 1980s. Basically, every kind of 10 years or so, there have been major directives on the NHS. And so I've got research on those sort of directives since the 1980s. They also, of course, look back in time as well. And then one's also got the initial mass observation material from the 1940s. So it's kind of a very important source to the project as a whole. So I'm hoping that the COVID material will provide a kind of a key end episode, I suppose, in this study. Yeah. The second project that this connects with is with my colleague Andrew Birchall, who's here today in the audience. We used the Mass Observation Project material, so going back to the 80s, for a project on composing, well-being and mental health. We explored some of the techniques, I think, that have been mentioned across these seminars within that, yeah. So one of the things we were really keen to do was to get away again from a kind of medicine-centered history of mental health and to look at mental health as a much broader phenomenon. And so we obviously used the NHS directives, but we, encouraged by Kirsty and her wonderful suggestions, went down kind of like unusual paths, like looking into directives on, you know, issues like gardening or my 16-year-old self and these kind of things as well. And I think that, you know, trying to sort of get a different sort of picture of mental health in doing so. We also did this kind of connecting up of lives method, yeah, longitudinal sort of work. So we found individuals that we felt were particularly interesting and traced them across different directives and across time. So I guess I'm really interested in how the COVID material speaks to some of the things that we were unearthing in that history of mental health. I think we're all conscious, excuse me. I'm very sorry about that. I'm in my department and we're all packing up our offices to move, and so it's chaos, yeah. So I hope I don't get any more interruptions, yeah. So anyway, the project on mental health, I think, is very much fits with the COVID material too. Thirdly, you know, further back in time, I suppose, I was really interested, and there's a lot of historiography that's very interested in the way in which the initial mass observation project is a really important source for thinking about how the Second World War as a kind of key crisis moment affects mental health. And I do, you know, listening to the seminars across the last weeks, it has struck me again and again how interesting it is to think about the richness of material that's there in the mass observation archives for the Second World War and how that's been deployed to think about mental health, how that actually sets up kind of really interesting comparative issues with the COVID material, yeah. So, okay, and I guess the other obvious starting points are being invited by Kirsty and Jessica to look at the COVID material and then the seminar series as well. I won't really go into that in any greater detail now. So I want to try and sort of reflect on where the COVID material might take us in relation to these two themes of the NHS history, firstly, and then the mental health issue, secondly. But I think actually these two things are quite overlapping and difficult to disentangle, yeah. So I've got I guess in terms of the NHS material, it would seem very obvious that the COVID material should speak to the history of the NHS. I think that the initial mass observation directive, and I think Kirsty and Jessica can correct me on this, actually asked questions about health, and it also asked questions about the government, yeah? Not directly asking questions about the NHS. And I guess I'm looking through the material, I'm kind of interested in these boundaries between health, the government and the NHS, because the COVID moment seems really interesting actually in terms of the government deploying the NHS actually on a kind of nightly basis or whatever in these kind of press conferences, etc. And the NHS becomes a really important vehicle for the public and governmental COVID strategy: stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. The NHS becomes deployed as a vehicle for getting people on side vis-a-vis the lockdown, for instance, yeah? So I wonder if I can just get rid of that. I've got a quote up here from one of the respondents to that directive, PhD student from Bristol, age 26, female, on clapping. So there's a huge amount of material actually on the clapping for carers phenomenon, just like there's a lot on things like PPE, for instance, yeah? So this quote, which I thought, can you all see that quote? Can you see the whole thing?
Yes.
Yes. I've got my little horrible picture that covers it over. Actually, how do I get rid of that?
If you go to there's a
minimize
top left.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
I've just minimized it. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So I guess what I found interesting about this quote was the way in which it does one of those sort of things that the mass observation material is quite good at doing in its very sort of reflective state. So it talks first of all about the feelings that this young woman had with the clap. It's sort of I guess it's meaning to her. It's the way that it helped her break free of isolation or whatever. But I'm really interested in the way in which she juxtaposes this with a note about her doctor friend who hates it because it passes off Tory exploitation of the NHS as jolly old blitz spirit. So I was thinking back to the kind of the discussion we had earlier about what's the value of NHS of MO material or whatever, yeah? And I think sometimes it is in the kind of way in which it throws up tensions and contradictions, yeah? And I'm very interested in that. Similarly, there's this response from a script writer, female, age 39. We say the NHS workers are heroes, but I think sometimes we do this to remove the fact they are people, as if they have special powers that protect them or make them different. So again, I think that I'm interested in the way in which these sort of big public moments of public narratives about COVID and about the place of the NHS within it already in kind of March, April of 2020 being thought through, I suppose, in people's own sort of self-reflections. On the other hand, that sits alongside something like this poem, Thoughts About Thursday, which comes up in the in a different area of the collection. So this is sort of I think it said it's labeled, the file's labeled non-mass observer COVID diaries, I think, if that makes any sense to Kirsty and Jessica. But I was really struck by the kind of militaristic language actually in this. Clap for our workers, clap for our carers at the front line where the violence is of an invisible kind. And it goes on to talk about thanking our soldiers in blue. And then it also ends with this line about, for then we can be free. So a couple of things there. I feel a kind of a caution against the view that everybody is reading these events in the same way, I suppose, yeah. But also I was very interested by that kind of then we can be free at the end as well. One of the things that I was conscious of looking through the material on the NHS is how much of it actually comes from the early stages of the lockdown. And one of the things that I'd be really interested to sort of look at is how things change across, yeah? How, you know, at what point the kind of the freedom kind of dimension starts coming to the fore. Right, I'm really racing across this. I'm going to move over to mental health, yeah? Okay. And one of the things that struck me looking at some of the material on mental health was that, and I guess I'm partly struck by this as well, because at the moment I'm conscious that in the arguments for end of lockdown and going back to normality, mental health is being deployed now as a kind of, you know, a counter to the value of, you know, of controlling COVID in a sense, yeah. You know, there's a sense that, you know, COVID lockdown has come at the expense of mental health. You know, it's a kind of very strong articulation of that in the public sphere. But one of the things, going back to some of the early stuff on COVID, I was really struck by the kind of, if you want, the kind of the positive mental health narratives there that were there as well, actually, about the lockdown. So this example from, again, that same PhD student in Bristol: a definite tranquility to it all. The constraints have found me marveling, more appreciative of little details I never quite felt before, like having my nerve endings somehow fine-tuned. She does also go on subsequently to say how she realizes that that's not the experience of everybody, and to sort of, I suppose, acknowledge a degree of guilt about feeling like that, which is interesting. A similar one is this respondent who talks about the lockdown as being a blessing in disguise. The interesting thing about this respondent as well is that this is someone who's got significant mental health problems that pre-exist COVID. And the response actually talks about the way in which the lockdown actually acts in a, I suppose, a vaguely therapeutic fashion. So it says, what I was racing for, or rather running from, was unclear. What I know is that I finally had a window to catch my breath and ask myself significant questions. What is standing between me and the life I could be living? this pandemic has been painful and traumatizing for many, but it has also been widely eye-opening. And I think, you know, I guess one of the things that I want to emphasize is that alongside the kind of negative narratives, of which there are many, I think there is this really interesting kind of existential, you know, narrative as well, about that actually people are rendering also in quite positive ways sometimes. Really interesting material is the material that traces you across time a little. So I think this is my final example. This is a COVID diary from a 64-year-old who actually, you know, I think she almost certainly falls ill with COVID, although as she acknowledges, there's no test to prove that it's COVID. And so it takes her through the path of that, yeah. And you get these kind of transitions between different mental states, and fascinating narratives of self-isolating from other people in the home as well. She also gets to this kind of, you know, sense that there's a positive as well at one point, this unadulterated time, the absolute luxury of that, a new rhythm of life having been uncovered. But by May, you know, she's talking about the kind of monotony of things and a malaise having crept in. Okay, so let me just get this back. A couple of points in conclusion. I have no idea, I've probably gone way over time, apologies. Yeah. I think I've really just thrown a few things at you, but I three thoughts in conclusion. I mean, the first one is that I do feel that the material that I've been looking at, and again, I have not looked at this systematically, yeah, but it tells a really very rich story for the earliest stages of COVID. I'll be interested in hearing from the others about whether the story goes through as clearly afterwards. I certainly think that, you know, just like historians have looked at the kind of the mental state of people in the Second World War, I think for COVID, for sure, this is going to be very interesting in terms of charting these transitions across time. That will work both for people's attitudes towards COVID and attitudes towards the NHS. Yeah, I do think that things like finding the way in which there were moments of positive as well as negative could be a really interesting thing to do. I guess the second thing to say is that I think that the value of the MO material, as often is the case with mass observation material, will be in helping us kind of recapture the things that are forgotten, recapture the way in which the reflections expose people who are kind of know two things at the same time, I suppose, actually, yeah. So they may be feeling one thing about the clap, but they know that at the same time it's performing political functions that they're less comfortable about. I think it's really valuable, you know, in a way that opinion polls are not, in starting to capture that. And I think my kind of strongest feeling is that it's material that can help us resist the imposition of very strong and often black and white public narratives about what happened in COVID and what COVID meant and how people experienced it. Because I think that is going to happen. It's already happening really now, yeah, and it has powerful kind of political purchase as well. So I think that for me, that's one of the really interesting things about this material. Yeah, trying to go back and capture some of those contradictions and tensions. And I'm really interested in it vis-a-vis the NHS as well, in the way in which it potentially exposes divisions, such as the way in which people's attitude towards the NHS may be as much about the staff, for example, in the NHS, and the way in which they may become increasingly alert to the political uses of a kind of NHS patriotism, nationalism, or whatever. Yeah, okay. So I think I can hopefully use it in some of these ways. I'll end.
Okay, thank you. That was great, Matthew. I think you kind of you've raised all sorts of things which might be picked up and developed in other talks. I just noticed that sort of a couple of people have their hands up. I can't see if I'm trying to think of. I think in principle what we wanted to do was kind of take questions at the end, if that's okay.
I think that's okay. I think they were clapping emojis.
Okay, sorry. Never mind. Okay, people just making trouble. Okay, thank you for the on Matthew's behalf. Thank you for the applause for Matthew. Okay, so maybe we should just move on then to. I think Matthew's already begun to touch on some issues around the kind of the rhythms and the temporalities which is in this material. So this is explicitly, I think, what Dawn and Rebecca are going to talk to. So over to you. I'm not sure who's going first. Dawn.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen and check that that's working for everybody. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And okay, I can see Rebecca, but I can't see you at the same time, Clive. So just shout if we go wrong or go over time. So I'm Dawn Lyon from the University of Kent, a reader in sociology, and I'll hand over to Becky to introduce herself and kick us off. We're going to go back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, hi, I'm Becky Coleman, reader and co-director of the Methods Lab in the Sociology Department at Goldsmiths, and it's really nice to be here, and we're going to be talking about some preliminary kind of ways into some of the mass observation data that we've been kind of looking at. Could you move the slide, Dawn? Thank you. Okay, so really what we're going to be talking about is a directive that we co-commissioned along with a group of other people who we're also kind of working with, which was specifically on COVID-19 and time, which was distributed in summer 2020. So people were writing in the autumn 2020, looking back mainly at the kind of very early stages of the pandemic. And we were really interested in the ways in which we thought the pandemic was changing time. So thinking about the pandemic through the lens of time. So we've got some British Academy funding to look at and analyse the reflective diary. So we had over 200 submitted to that directive. And we're also working with other methods, generating further original material through what we're calling field tanks, where young people are going to talk about, reflect on their temporal experiences, so things like stuckness or acceleration or exhaustion, these kinds of things, or yeah, maybe exhilaration, positive as well as negative feelings, that may have emerged from or been kind of intensified through the pandemic. And we're kind of working on some public engagement materials. We recorded some learning resources yesterday around kind of methodology. We've got a couple more to do. And as you can see on the slide, this is also part of a wider project. So the people listed there were part of the team who commissioned the directive along, working alongside Jessica and Kirsty. Okay, so yeah, this is I mentioned the ways in which we are looking at the pandemic through this lens of time. So this was our starting point for commissioning the directive, focusing specifically on potentially new and changing temporal experiences of everyday life. So in the early days of the pandemic especially, we were noticing the prosaic but also extraordinary changes and disruptions to everyday life. So new experiences of time, chaos, frenzy, slowness, and new forms of social time. So educational schedules, supermarket shopping slots, waiting in queues for deliveries, and those kinds of things. And we were also thinking about the ways in which these changed temporal practices in turn inform people's sense of the present and the reach of the future. So we're interested in how these new temporalities are both collective and differentiated. So asking questions about whose time was sped up and slowed down, when and how, and whether new collective moods and atmospheres can be ascertained through this focus on temporality. So one of the things that we're interested in then is the ways in which the pandemic has highlighted that time is not just this kind of unproblematic, neutral backdrop to everyday life, but it can be rapidly reconstructed and reorganized as well as experienced. So our approach considers this idea of time not as this neutral backdrop to social life, but as actively made and remade through infrastructures or assemblages. So relations between environments, services, technologies, people, commodities, and the ways in which particular values or politics emerge and are kind of reinforced. So we draw on work on the social life of time, and I won't read all the quotations here, but you can see we're referencing here the work of Michelle, Bastien and colleagues, who talk about how a focus on the social life of something suggests an interest in foregrounding the active capacities of what has traditionally been thought of as inert, and then kind of thinking about the agency or the activity of particular manifestations of time, and situating them by tracing them through particular contexts and everyday activities. So one of the things that this work on the social life of time that Dawn and I are kind of interested in and kind of trying to contribute to is that it's also asking questions about or drawing attention to the politics of time. So again, those kinds of questions that you can see Bastien and colleagues kind of posing there. So, you know, who is included and excluded, who appears and disappears, who benefits, who suffers, and who gets to decide. So those are some of the kind of founding kind of questions or things that we're interested in looking at.
Thanks, Becky. So I'm going to tell you something about the directive itself, which we commissioned, and as others have acknowledged, this is always a collaborative process with Kirsty and Jessica in our case, and we drafted something together, went back and forth, and this is what's on the slide here. This is the first paragraph of our directive, and then we had several sections with additional questions and stimulations for reflection on the themes at the bottom there: rhythm, home life, media, technology and waiting. And really we just want to kind of acknowledge what work our directive did in producing the diary of reflections that we then obtained. So it started by asserting that COVID has disrupted life as we know it. So it's really signalling that there's a fundamental temporal change, and we think that also helps us stimulate people to reflect and shed and will overall shed light on what kind of time this is. And then really there are three temporal relations towards the end of this paragraph. We ask people to look back on their experiences of time and COVID so far, to consider from the present what it might mean for life to get back to normal. So there's a kind of both a future and a past present that's connected to the current everyday, and then imagine what the future might hold. And it's interesting what people are able to say about those three temporal relations. In terms of how we make sense of what the diaries are, this probably isn't the right audience to go into lots of depth about this because people are very familiar with the literature. But we just wanted to make a couple of comments how writing is, of course, inherently a temporal process. And just as in some of the examples Mathew just gave, people are situating themselves in time. I think the comment in one of the quotes you shared, Matthew, was about earlier this afternoon I was reflecting on something. We have quite a lot of that. So we've got these lovely textures of time around the diaries themselves. And of course, diary writing generates time. As Anushka and colleagues have put it, it might be an expansive synchronic moment. So something about the intensity of a moment, even if the actual everyday experience of time is relatively uneventful. Of course, following other colleagues also present, we see the diaries as microethnographies, the diary writers as themselves participant observers. That gives them this dual vision, as Kramer has so eloquently put it, writing about their experiences and writing of themselves in a social context, all the while with this kind of knowingness that these accounts are going to be read and interpreted anew by sociologists and other social scientists. So for us, the diaries do have a lot in common with interview narrations. I know some people have a different view there, but of course, without the usual relationships that are behind the text, and we've been discussing and reflecting on those, including what they mean for our ethical conduct. But they allow us to answer key questions about time, to really reflect on how we inhabit the present and how we might make sense of change as it's happening. And then really just a couple of comments on what we do with the material, so how we read the material. And we'd like to reflect further on reading as a sort of research practice, as itself primary encounter with the material. We haven't heard it in a different form first. So we're reading across the text through different codes and extracts, in depth through individual accounts that kind of capture what might be in the air, for silences and absences. That's something we've really been focusing on lately. And then just, we wanted to make the point that sometimes the sample of mass observation diary writers is criticised for being a little bit narrow in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, but we wonder if their characteristics in terms of age especially really coincide with some of those most vulnerable to COVID, and so their voices have particular weight and importance. And then just a final point about the sort of liveliness, the immediacy and intimacy of the diaries enable us to really think of working with them as a form of live sociology that cultivates and emphasises our own attentiveness and imagination.
So we're going to turn now just to give kind of these two different ways in, well, two different but we think hope complementary ways of kind of looking at and exploring the material submitted to the directive. And first, we're interested in what cultural theorist Raymond Williams terms a structure of feeling. And I know that some of you here have been will be very familiar with this, but this is the idea that there is a particular quality of social experience and relationship historically distinct from other particular qualities, which gives the sense of a generation or period. So kind of one of the things that we're kind of interested in doing is thinking about whether we can designate or kind of identify a structure of feeling kind of emerging in the directive around kind of COVID, and we'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But one of the reasons we think this is interesting is that Williams identifies temporality as key to designating a structure of feeling. So he talks about a structure of feeling as the active, flexible and temporal present. And while he's focusing on the present here, his conception of a structure of feeling is more mobile than this suggests, because he suggests that it's composed of both residual practices. So he talks about practices that are kind of in the past but are nevertheless still active, or kind of they're nevertheless still there in some way, or here in some way. And he also talks about it as being kind of composed of practices, moods, values and beliefs that are pre-emergent. So he talks about this as somehow kind of active and pressing, but not yet fully articulated. So in this way, as we're kind of interested in time, we're interested in the way in which a structure of feeling kind of tells us about the present, but is also kind of composed of these multiple and perhaps contradictory or kind of heterogeneous kind of temporalities. So that's one of the things we're interested in. So he's really kind of trying to kind of draw attention to a collective mood or atmosphere. And here we're kind of also thinking with and kind of drawing on Ben Hymel's work around mass observation being a kind of means of identifying and thinking with popular feeling, and the idea of the kind of the diaries being a kind of a weather map, or kind of, as Dawn mentioned earlier, kind of saying that there's something kind of in the air. And also the discussion around kind of the ways in which affective states have this kind of temporal dimension to them. So our focus is on kind of these things through this lens of or this interest in temporality. But I guess just another thing to say here is that while a structure of feeling is a collective mood or atmosphere, it's not unified or settled. It is in solution, as Williams puts it, and it's subject to contestation, struggle and disagreement. So in these senses, it facilitates an appreciation and exploration of the politics of kind of culture, or put in terms of the question that Michelle Bastian and her colleagues kind of stage, it kind of asks us to think about the politics of time. So one of the things we're beginning to explore with the diary entries then is whether we can identify one or multiple structures of feeling emerging there, and also in the field tanks that we're going to be doing with the university and college students as well. So it's probably fair to say that at the very least, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a mood or an atmosphere or a structure of feeling of uncertainty in Britain and other parts of the global north. And of course, here it's really important to recognise how uncertainty is distributed differently, it's felt differently in different parts of the global north and the global south. But in terms of the respondents to the directive, we had this theme of uncertainty emerges a lot. So one writer says that the certainty in not knowing how long the wait for normality will be is the hardest part for me. It's difficult to look forward to things in the future because we have no way of knowing whether they'll happen. I was reflecting on this earlier today. So again, that kind of temporal location or kind of making of time. And those other two quotes there from the diaries also kind of say something similar. You know, it's really hard to plan for things. The uncertain feeling has been unsettling. And in that last one, feeling between kind of one thing and another and not being clear. I'm not waiting for normal, but I do have but do have a waiting for some new normal, but not sure what that is. So this kind of then uncertainty is one of the things we're kind of interested in, and also perhaps this idea of being between or feeling between one thing and another. So uncertainty then we think can be helpfully understood in terms of what the cultural theorist Lauren Ballant calls an impasse, and it feels especially poignant talking about their work at the moment, given they passed a couple of weeks ago, and I think this is the first time I'm kind of talking about their work. But Ballant talks about an impasse as usually designating a time of dithering from which someone or some situation cannot move forward. And they adapt this to refer variously to a stretched out present, a state of animated suspension, a holding pattern suggesting a temporary housing. So this is this idea that this stretch of time is all or what this is. And we noted that there was many kind of popular ways in which the early parts of the pandemic, but also ongoing, have been talked about is in terms of this kind of this kind of impasse, a kind of where there's kind of no kind of end point, and it's just kind of now. And I think they kind of came out in some of the quotations that Mathew was talking about as well. But this one participant here talked about how, as we were going through the early stages of the pandemic, no one knew how long it was going to last, and nobody knows that today after 7 months of it. We can probably say the same thing right now. But they also, and I'm kind of got quite taken with this, they talk about a Radio 2 interview with a writer called Olga Mekin, talking about the Dutch concept of Nixon. I hope I'm saying that right, which literally means to do nothing. There seems no sort of rigorous practice behind it, as there is with mindfulness or meditation or any self-improvement, but it's kind of something that is gently, almost accidentally arrived at or drifted into. I liked the sound of it, but predicted that many of the show's listeners would respond along the lines of, well, I wish I had time to do nothing. I've got 3 kids, 2 jobs, my husband works away and so on. But they note that they were pleasantly surprised and that people were engaging with the concept and gave examples of how it featured in their lives. So one woman called it blobbing, which I really like. So I just think we're keen to kind of think a bit more with this idea of blobbing, and we're also kind of noting the ways in which uncertainty has also been kind of written about in relation to the impasse and structures the feeling in work around events and the kind of ongoing events such as Brexit. So Ben Anderson's and colleagues' work around this. So we think there's connections to make there. But I'll pass over to Donna.
Thanks, Becky. So a second temporal orientation that's got connections to what Becky's just been talking about that we bring to bear on this material is a focus on rhythm. And really the idea of this is for the purchase it offers of making sense of the making and remaking of time of the time of the pandemic, and it allows us to trace spatio-temporal variability, so ebbs and flows, rather than anything that's too kind of one-dimensional. So in a way, this also connects to some interpretations of the idea of an impasse, but we've had characterizations of this time as for some people speeding up or generally slowing down, as a kind of a flattened version of time that's suspended or extended, and rhythm helps us notice variability along the way, so these ebbs and flows, if you like, and really the unevenness against these flattening tendencies of kind of imposing a theoretical formulation on what's happening. So we're drawing here on rhythm analysis from Henri Lefebvre and Catherine Regulier, who really use it to focus on the interplay of space and time. And in this, rhythm is both a tool and an object of analysis, and other things besides. But for our purposes, it means that we can emphasize and seek to disentangle some of the specific rhythms that shape everyday life, and also use rhythm as a lens through which we can really grasp how everyday life is taking shape differently and is being remade through rhythm. So I just want to share some examples here that really point to some different kinds of rhythms that we've identified in our preliminary reading of the diaries. So in the first case, there's a sort of reference to some kind of normality, a return to normality, but actually this just emphasizes the strangeness of time and also connects to the point about uncertainty here. There's a disordering of time, she says. It's no longer linear, no clear direction in which we're headed. It's as though time has become circular instead. So we've got a direct opposition here between the linear and the circular, but actually what's interesting using the ideas of Lefebvre and Regulier is to think about how they interrelate and interfere with one another. But then she says perhaps more here, read that as time is more here, there's greater intensity, less oriented to the past or present. And I wonder if that's a slip there. Becky and I were talking about it earlier, but that we would have expected her to say less oriented to the past or the future, but maybe it just indicates the way that the future is absent and really difficult to imagine from this particular present. A second instance of a relationship to rhythm is disruption, or what Lefebvre calls arrhythmia. So one of the diary writers writes, I was stopped in my tracks. So a really sort of deliberate moment at which time is suspended or arrested and then something else takes shape. And what we get from many of the diaries is a certain loosening of the hold of linear time, but this is experienced as both freedom, as in this case, but also disorientation. So in the next example here, we've got a sense of time slipping away without me noticing where it's going. So we've got a real rendering of temporal agency there, but almost that leaves the subject behind and leaves her feeling unmotivated and out of time, disconnected, cast out of a temporal infrastructure. And then in the final example here, we've got an aspect of time where that comes to mind, where everything before COVID seems so long ago. It's a really simple statement, but feels really powerful, that there's a distance there in time of the current everyday with different moments. Just going to jump over this one so we finish almost on time. And just talk about tuning into new rhythms, and the emphasis in the diaries in our coding. The new rhythms is a really powerful code for us, so there's lots of examples of that. And as we've heard about in popular accounts, lots of people have focused on new relationships with the natural environment and whatever it might be, the seasons, the weather. And we've got a number of examples of that. The first one here, looking out of my bedroom window at night, I was surprised and amazed at the beauty of a turquoise sky. Now that one particularly appeals to me because it shows something about the attentiveness of the diary writer, but it's the looking out of my window that Lefebvre, in his famous chapter Seen from the Window, looks out of his window at the back of his apartment to his garden and comments on how nothing is really inert in the world, despite our assumptions, and that it requires a certain time of attentiveness to really appreciate those rhythms. And I also liked in Matthew's example, the one about somebody saying that the time of COVID gave her a window to make some significant changes, and it made me want to go and search the material for window used as metaphor as well as literal infrastructure. So just to conclude then, we've presented here two ways into the diaries through structures of feeling and rhythm, as we explore the sense that the diaries and the authors have made of the time of the pandemic and consider their viewpoints alongside our own readings of them to really grasp what's going on. And in so doing, we're making use of this focus on time to explore the small matters of the everyday. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks ever so much, Dawn and Rebecca. I think there's all sorts of emerging themes, both partly because I know what I'm about to say, so across all three of the talks, hopefully that we've heard. So thanks very much. And so I'm going to move on. I'm now going to have that challenge of sharing my screen. Let's do that. See if that works. Did that work? Can anybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let me do that a bit properly then. Right. Okay. So, and I think what I'll be talking to will overlap with things that both Matthew and Dawn and Rebecca have said. I'm going to talk to one sort of theme that's emerging from the work that Nick and I have been doing as part of our project. This is kind of very much. I think this is the first time we've attempted to talk about this, so this is very much our first kind of cut at trying to talk about this particular strand. So we have this British Academy project, which is partly where the seminar series comes from. I'll say very briefly how we're making use of the material. What we're focusing on is the material generated last year in 2020. So starting with a special directive through to the summer directive at the end of the year. So actually, including the Rebecca and Dawn's directive, as well as the May 12th diaries. So that's kind of a. I mean, in principle, we could keep going, couldn't we? But just in practice, it's an awful lot of stuff. But it also has a certain sort of order to it, kind of the special directive that Jessica and Kirsty kind of was sent out, if I'm not mistaken, the week before lockdown was actually announced. So you have this, as the pandemic is arriving or becoming more of an issue through lockdown itself, the first lockdown itself, and then the period from May onward through the rest of the summer and early autumn in which lockdown was eased. So that's the period we're looking at. Strictly speaking, we've done purposive sampling. Insofar as I'm a proper social scientist, I thought I'd say that, which actually what means is that we've selected, rather than trying to look at all of the material, we've selected I think about 60 of the respondents, as well as a specific selection of the May 12th diaries, and we've done so broadly speaking using a methodology that Nick and Jonathan Moth, who's here I think today, have used before on a previous project, to kind of get a as diverse and sort of representative a range of people as possible. There's interesting question too about analysis and reading, which Rebecca and Dawn mentioned that we could talk about too. Essentially, what we've been doing, the two of us, is we've been reading the same material, which Jessica and Kirsty kind of generated for us. Nick and I have both been reading the same stuff, the same people, and then talking about it. And so, well, this was interesting, and identifying themes. So I'm not quite sure if that, I'm never sure if that counts as coding, reading and underlining and using post-its and then talking to people. That's our analysis. So there's various issues and things which we kind of are interested in discussing. The one I'm going to particularly talk about now is sort of the theme of fear, and the way in which the materials from last year have people writing about broadly speaking fear, anxieties and worries and fear and other related kind of emotions in all sorts of different ways. So we're picking up on the same theme. I think it's already been mentioned, the idea that mass observation materials kind of represent an archive of feeling, that people are writing often about what they feel about X, Y, and Z. They're often prompted explicitly to write about what they feel about things. In this case, why fear? Well, fear has been kind of part of the public discourse and debate around the pandemic, kind of not least around sort of lockdown. Skeptics have often invoked the idea that fear has been mobilized for political purposes or weaponized, to use a phrase which has been used. So there's a kind of a public discourse about how calculations of risk and responsibility and rationality have been shaped by constructions of fear. There's if you like, a kind of a more serious conceptual point about thinking about emotions like fear as almost the background to kind of more rational looking calculations of risk. So in a sense, one of the things we're interested in using the archive for is as evidence to ask the question of what is it that people have been afraid of? Not least in relation to, kind of, again, another set of discussions, obviously very central public discussions about people complying or not complying with rules and guidelines. And all sorts of discussions about how to explain that or how to interpret that. Again, a prior question might be, well, what is it that people have been worried about, which may or may not help explain how they've been conducting themselves? So for this presentation, this strand of our thought, we're interested in this question of using the materials as this archive of evidence of both what and how people articulate their fears and concerns and worries around COVID and the pandemic. There's sort of like two ways of, in a sense, presenting this material or analysing this strand of material. This is almost kind of a challenge for us in writing this strand of the stuff up. One of which is kind of to make a series of analytical points, which we like, of course, we want to make these points, which is almost to sort of like to go in and extract examples of different, in a sense, theoretical findings. So one of the important points we want to make, hence the kind of working title, is the idea that affective states like fear, first of all, they're about things. People are fearful of certain sorts of things in the broadest possible sense of things. They haven't objects. So that there are a series of practices, and people talk about and write about and reflect upon their fears and anxieties in relation to and in the context of particular practices. Those might be fears about other people, interacting with other people, or fears for other people, or loved ones getting sick, They're articulated in relation to discussions of particular kinds of objects or occasions, so going shopping, going into public spaces, fears about things you can't do or whether one would be able to do certain sorts of things. So there's a kind of set of practical dimensions to this, which analytically we could identify. There's also, as I said, a kind of a set of emotional registers you can find. People are sometimes explicitly fearful, but then often just more perhaps sad or worried or anxious as well sometimes, and almost in relation to those more negative emotions, kind of happy or pleased. So that's one way of cutting the material. The way we're sort of inclined to kind of at least present the material is through what I'm kind of calling here kind of the emergent sort of analysis almost that you get coming out of the material, which so what I'm going to suggest is that there is kind of like almost an emergent narrative shape that you can see across this range of material in the way in which people themselves are talking about their experiences from March roughly to the late summer, early autumn of 2020. Now, in part, that shape follows from the sequencing of the directives, one immediately before lockdown, then one essentially in the middle of lockdown, the 12th of May directive, diary as that lockdown is eased, and then the summer directive with people reflecting back. So the shape might, you think, you might kind of suppose follows from that sequencing. I'm kind of make as a proposition slash hypothesis that you actually have that kind of narrative shape emerging in the way in which people are writing about these experiences, partly prompted to do so by one of the directives that Lyon and Rebecca have talked about. But bearing in mind that mass observation material, the nature of the data is narrative. It's often explicitly reflective. Again, as Dawn and Rebecca have said, people stepping back and writing and reflecting, sometimes transposing diaries and commenting on their own diary extracts a couple of months later. So it strikes me as a really interesting kind of process to sort of spot the way in which, if you like, the kind of the forms of narrative that people are drawing upon to make sense of their own experience. So the way in which we're going to cut this material is by suggesting that you have kind of almost this threefold phasing of evident in the material. You have this moment in which people are writing about the imminent arrival of the pandemic up to the middle or late March, kind of waiting for it, seeing it coming from afar, talking about what they're learning about Italy, knowing things are going to come. That's both kind of something you see in that kind of as it were, the real-time material from the week or so before lockdown was announced, but also when people reflect, they talk about that moment. You then have an awful lot of material in which people sort of basically talk about what life was like in lockdown. So reflecting on in a sense when as lockdown itself just becomes routine and the routines of lockdown. And so there's interesting ways in which one can see the nature of anxieties and the natures of fear take on different kind of purchase in that context. And then thirdly, you kind of have this moment, not least around the 12th of May diaries, in which having settled into lockdown and almost in a sense perhaps begun to be able to manage anxieties and fears, or still going through roller coasters, the easing of restrictions from the middle of May onwards generates a new set of ways of talking about worries and anxieties and fears. So that's the narrative we're going to present. I'm not sort of going to go through loads and loads of things in detail. In a sense, the main headline of our presentation at least is that kind of threefold shape. So the first of these moments is this sense, this set of discussions, which takes different forms, lots of variety, of course, but broadly speaking, around a sense of foreboding, of being able to see that something is about to happen. And people kind of talk about this, write about this in different ways and in relationship to different issues, sometimes very concrete worries. So one recurring theme is, of course, around kind of panic buying and people worrying about how to provision themselves, how to do online ordering. So that kind of very practical worry is one way in which this moment, this first moment, this moment of foreboding, if you like, takes on its shape. There are different extracts and examples we could give. This example is actually, it is from an extract in which this woman is talking about that moment, reflecting back. But more generally, this is a really neat kind of extract in which she kind of actually says out loud, basically, the whole range of emotions that she's been experienced. She's been sad and frightened and pessimistic, but also stressed and irritable, panicky, and happy, grateful, appreciative. So there's a whole range of things she's kind of telling us here that she's feeling. I guess my point is that you can kind of take that range and you can sort of, you know, almost track it back through own person's narratives and other people's, and kind of see how sometimes these emotions, particularly the more negative ones, are attached to sort of very specific things like worrying about getting COVID or one's partner getting it, but then other sorts of worries about one's pension, or one couple actually very explicitly worrying about their children not being able to arrange their funerals should they die. So I was at a really interesting practical worries and concerns become clear, I think. So you kind of have this first stage then in which people are writing about the sorts of worries and concerns they have or did have, looking back, when it was when the pandemic was becoming it was becoming clear it was about to become a big thing, and that lockdown was likely to happen. And not least, as I said, partly because lots of this is reflective. This is a way in which people are narrating their experience retrospectively later in the year, as well as having often have not really taken things seriously enough, or actually taken things very seriously, but sort of not really thinking that was going to be that serious, but it turned out to be really serious after all. So a whole series of different kind of registers in which that phase is talked about. And secondly, then there's a, as I said, in a sense, from the material we've looked at, perhaps the largest chunk, as it were, the largest slice of the topics is people writing about being in lockdown. And again, I think there's a whole series of different forms of worry and anxiety and fear that are being articulated around that moment. And again, this is a sort of just one extract in which, again, this person is explicitly saying out loud they've been through an emotional roller coaster. I love the idea that, you know, they've been controlling it, as no doubt many of us did, through some combination of alcohol and chocolate. They've been stressed and anxious, but also there's a sense here that there's something becoming kind of a little bit more routine and normal, settling into a kind of routine and normality. And that's the emphasis of an awful lot of the material we've looked at from this, either from or about that period of lockdown one, the first lockdown. Sometimes, of course, what an awful lot of the material we're looking at, and you'll be familiar with this, those of you, lots of you will be much more familiar with mass observation in general than I. Of course, what people spend lots of time doing is just actually reporting things, descriptive reporting, as well as kind of reflective reflections on experience and feelings. So I've written here choreographies of social distancing. These are really notes to me. That's a reference to one of the respondents. I think of him as Man from Wigan, I think. Provides these really very detailed descriptions of walking around during lockdown. So not so much where he went for walks, and not really what he felt like going on walks, but describing stepping off the pavement as you walked along, and how other people stepped off the pavement for you, or how perhaps some people didn't do that, waiting at doorways. So he provides a really detailed and ongoing set of descriptions of as I say, what we might think of as the new conventions of social distancing which emerge. Now, in principle, of course, these aren't accounts of kind of what he's afraid of or what other people are afraid of, but I think in this context, of course, that is exactly what their commentaries upon the practices through which people are adjusting their behaviour to a set of fears and anxieties. The other note here is I put it as a note because it would be a really long extract, which we'll find a way of presenting surely at some point. Baby's dreams are not thinking about COVID. One of the respondents is a woman who, I think she has a birthday in the course of writing her responses. So she starts at 29 and then she's 30. But at the beginning of lockdown, she's actually on maternity leave. So actually she starts by saying, well, actually it doesn't really seem to have made much difference. And might be projecting from my own experience, but you kind of get the sense of this person, both she and her partner, are kind of immersed already in this particular weird context of sort of hunkered down, trying to get through the new baby. They have a new baby and a toddler. So again, lots of her discussion of her fears and anxieties revolve around often very ordinary things about kind of trying to work out whether or not the diarrhea in the kid's poo is sort of COVID or not. So a practical focus for a set of concerns. This person also has dreams. Dreams are a recurring topic in lots of this material. She has a recurring dream which she keeps kind of writing about, which involves, as I recall, it involves, the dream is about how she ends up living with her living with her parents, as well as with her brother, and how the parents are treating her brother much better than they are her. So it's kind of quite entertaining to read. It's really kind of an interesting theme. I think it's an example of another theme you see in lots of this material about how people articulate fears of loss of autonomy. In this case, in this woman's case, she's writing about moving back into the parents. Lots of the older respondents write about loss of autonomy in different sorts of ways. So that's a very interesting kind of theme, I think. But the other reason why the whole stretch of this person's, she's writing sort of not daily, but regular daily updates, diary entries, that's what she submitted, is sort of, as time goes on, she's basically sort of talking about the fact that everything's just settling down and becoming new normal. So by the beginning of May, shortly before kind of restrictions are lifted, she's explicitly saying, well, I've not really thought about it very much. I'm no longer really thinking about any of this because we're just kind of getting on with our routine. Routine which is shaped by various sorts of concerns, but she sort of says at least is not actually that reflective. So there's a whole set of interesting ways in which the kind of routines of lockdown can be seen to be articulating various sorts of anxieties and worries. Then, as I say, the kind of third phase, which is becomes very clear, I think, in the material from the sort of the summer directives and also around the 12th of May diaries, which people themselves write about, is a shift in mood, if you like, once lockdown begins to be eased. That's clear in the 12th May diaries, where people are sort of explicitly saying 2 days ago the Prime Minister was on TV and announced these changes, and people are unclear, uncertain, sometimes a little angry around kind of the nature of the changes. And then that becomes a topic that people are writing about more generally as they reflect on kind of how things have been going through the summer. Again, this is just one, don't expect you all to read this in detail. It's really there as another example. This is a kind of a respondent, a male respondent from Leeds. One of the interesting things about this person across all of his responses through the year is, as you can see, he ends each day's comments by listing the number of cases in Leeds. So I think the kind of way in which factual materials show up in these materials are really interesting. But he's also kind of, I guess my sense of this part, this is him reflecting back on July, what was entries from July, you kind of get this sense of of the way in which the easing of restrictions from May onwards generates, to pick up on the theme that Dawn and Rebecca talked about, a new set of uncertainties that generate different sorts of anxieties, not least anxieties and fears about quite what it is that we're meant to be doing now compared to lockdown, which may have been full of anxieties and fears, but at least there was a sense that kind of people knew what they're meant to be doing. Anxieties about what people are meant to be doing, anxieties about, well, actually, is it really safe? Really interesting discussion here where this man kind of talks about how he initially feels extremely self-conscious about mask wearing, but it becomes normal. So you kind of see here an emergence of a new normal, but shaped, I think, in the type of analysis we want to kind of develop around a shift in the if like in the direction of the uncertainties involved once things had opened up. So I realise I'm racing through as we do. I'm kind of one of my experiences working with mass observation is it takes all the problems of qualitative research more generally about how do you kind of squeeze all this rich narrative material into manageable stories of your own, and it kind of takes all those and just magnifies them massively. So that standard point about the fact that there's lots of variety and simplifying generally. Nevertheless, I want to kind of close then just by reiterating, first of all, that sense that we think there's kind of this really interesting kind of narrative pattern that emerges in the material across which we've been looking at, which is emergent from how people themselves are articulating their fears and their worries in that kind of in that mode of sort of there was this thing happening, then it arrived and we settled into new routines, and then things opened up, and the shape and the structure of fears and anxieties and worries changes across that period. So you can kind of make some sort of, to conclude, we'll make some sort of analytical claims, theoretical claims, one of which would be this idea that fears and anxieties have objects. What people, I've shown you a couple of people saying I was fearful and anxious, but generally what people are talking about is often in descriptive as well as reflective ways, worried about getting sick, worries about their partners getting sick, worries about losing their jobs, worries about pensions, worries about, sometimes people of course are worried about whether or not they're doing the right thing, maybe whether they get caught. There's a series of different emotional registers, which we probably have to do a bit more thinking about. Worry and anxiety, disquiet, sometimes relief, more positive emotions, which have a kind of internal dialectical relationship perhaps to fear and anxiety. I kind of wrote versions of uncertainty here, going back to a theme that Dawn and Rebecca touched upon. There's a particular diary entry in which a woman says around May the 12th, I think, so it might be a May the 12th diary, in which she sort of says about her mother. She says her mother's not worried, but she's uncertain. And I kind of really it suddenly made me stop and think that's a really kind of interesting distinction in a sense, not necessarily between worry and uncertainty, but about the different things that people are uncertain of and the different types of anxiety and fear that different sorts of different types of uncertainty generate. Sometimes people are just uncertain because they don't know certain sorts of information. Sometimes they're uncertain because, of course, you can't see a virus. Sometimes they're uncertain because they're not sure what it is they're meant to be doing. So there's a whole series of uncertainties, which again, I think sort of not mechanically, but you can kind of see layered across these phases. There's also, I think, an interesting way in which again, it's not that everybody thinks the same thing, but the ways in which government is talked about and politics is talked about changes across that period. It's not that everybody doesn't like the government. Lots of people don't really like the government, which might not be a surprise given the kind of nature of mass observers, but lots of people are kind of perfectly happy and think the government's doing a very good job. But there's certainly kind of more disquiet by the time you get to May onwards. And the point again in relation to kind of the theme of feeling is sort of more kind of explicit anger and versions of anger being articulated. My final point then is to really go back to this theme, which is really a hypothesis, and so I'm to kind of invoke Laurent Ballant. This idea that the narrative shape that I've articulated about these three moments or these three phases is you can see it emerging from the writing itself. It's not simply because that was the structure of the sequence. And so this is kind of, I mean, in a sense, that's you can believe us or not, essentially. But it strikes me that the more I think about it, that's an interesting dimension to this type of material. That what you can, particularly in this context, in the context of COVID, in which a whole series of things which are established in a routine have kind of disappeared. People are often writing about their fears and anxieties generated by loss and absence and restrictions, so that what people can't do, aren't able to do, things which have disappeared, people they can't engage with. And Ballant has this nice theme of kind of genre flailing, which is part of a more complicated theoretical architecture of thinking that emotions and affects are genres, so they have generic features, which is this idea, I guess what she's getting at is the sense that in moments of crisis, people are kind of reaching out, trying to kind of pick on not just stories, but more broadly practices, ways of making sense and of ordering their experiences. So I think you can kind of sort of see a version of that going on in this material, not least across this sort of three-phase sense of it was coming, it arrived, and then having settled into one new normal, we were suddenly plunged into another new normal, and that's kind of a story which might still be going on. So anyway, I'll kind of stop there.